Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my natural co host,
Mm,
Brett.
I love it, Alice. You never disappoint. And there are times when I wonder whether you're going to be able to come up with anything, but you always do. It's very impressive.
I do my best because you guys, I don't know. I get a little like punch drunk whenever we talk about particularly exciting legal issues. And this really does absolutely no sarcasm falls into the category of incredibly interesting legal issues, not just because it has massive ramifications on probably at least someone maybe my own life. Maybe not, I don't know. um, and I just from an apolitical perspective, legally, I think this is such an interesting question. What are we talking about? Something you may have seen in the news. I don't know, the last few weeks. Birthright citizenship.
Yeah. And, politics is boring, but the Constitution is awesome. So now this is, whenever we get to talk about these constitutional issues, it always makes me happy because it's so fascinating to see the way things have developed, why things are the way they are, why things tend to be more complicated than you think they are. This is one where I think a lot of people feel like this is just very straightforward, but it's actually not. It has this long history. In fact, we're going to do 2 parts on this because discussing the history is going to take up a whole part, and then talking about the Supreme Court jurisprudence will be another part. So I'm looking forward to this one.
Me too. Me too, indeed. Okay. So if you have no idea what we're talking about, don't worry. As always, we don't assume people actually watch the news. And if you've been keeping out of the news the last couple of weeks, probably for the best for most people's, like, I don't know, blood pressure.
I mean, I'm over here trying to decide whether I'm going to work tomorrow because apparently, if I just send an email that says resign, I get 9 months of severance. So
That's
I don't
right. I
know.
know. I
It's
feel
pretty
like
tempting.
my New York Times, Wall Street Journal's like notifications are my life, right? Like I
Yeah.
saw the notification. It was like if a federal employee wants to resign, they can get, 8, 9 months of paid leave. And I was like, this affects a
Yeah.
lot of people I know.
Yeah. I was like, huh.
That's a
Huh.
lot of money. Not it's
Yeah.
not money. It's time. Right?
Yeah.
This
I
is what
texted my
everybody
boss and
wants.
was like, I don't even know if I'm gonna clean out my office. I may just it's like consider my see you later today my goodbye. But no, I'll
You
probably
are you
continue
are
to work there.
too important. They would probably scratch back that. Is that it's not even an EO. They probably would scratch back that policy as soon as they saw your email, Brett. You're that important.
I'm
Well,
sure. I'm sure.
anyways, if you have not been following all the things, and truthfully, there have been a lot of things happening this first week of the new administration. And one of the things that has been a hot topic ever since the campaign trail is birthright citizenship. But now that President Trump is in office on January 20th, the first day he's in office, he kept the promise that he made on the campaign trail, which is that he so excited I can't even talk, which is that he issued an executive order among like hundreds of others. But one of the executive orders was related to birthright citizenship. So, first of all, before this became like a campaigning, trope, what is birthright citizenship? That's a very good question. So, it's known as jus soli or the right of soil, and this is just birthright citizenship is where you are born, the soil where you're born. So Texans do this a lot. I don't know if other states are like really into this, but like Texans feel use solely to their bones. I have many friends who move elsewhere in the United States, not another country. I'm talking like they live in Mississippi or they move to DC for a job and they're about to have their child, but they want to make sure their child is usually Texan. And so they
Mm.
quite literally fly or ship up Texas soil and put it under the hospital bed. This is not one friend who's done this. This is like dozens of my friends who have done this. Is this a Texas thing?
Yeah, that is well. I mean, maybe somebody's going to write in and say other states do that. I will say this: I love the state of Alabama. I'm Alabama to my core. I've never heard of that.
You have I'm not laughing. I'm saying this because just in researching you solely, I realized perhaps this was a weird thing that Texans did.
Yeah, that's something else. Texans, man. I don't know what it is about Texans. That is, look, I appreciate it. I appreciate that
Wow.
that love. But
Okay.
wow,
We're
wow.
getting a little tangenty, but I hope that example shows you that tells you exactly what you solely means, right? Where the soil you are born on, that's where you are a citizen of.
Joe in the chat points out something interesting. Is that why you were married in Texas? Is that the only place it would be legally binding if you
I'm
actually were
not
married in
I'm
Texas?
not gonna say I didn't have a little Texas dirt in my pockets when I went to the hospitals for my other kids. Just saying. Just saying.
Wow. Wow. Okay. Well, there you go.
Okay. I definitely did that for my oldest son because he was born I didn't want him to be stateless because he was born in DC.
Mm,
That's not a state.
mm,
And so I was like,
that's
"You know
true.
what? I don't know if this is, like, appropriate or constitutional, but he doesn't have a state, so at least I'm giving him a state." So I definitely did it for him.
Okay. Learn
Alright,
something
we're
new
gonna
about
move
you
on
every
real
day,
quick.
Alice.
This is getting
Okay.
weird real quick. Now, here's the thing that we are quickly finding out about use soli. What I just described about Texas, apparently not every state does that. And here's the thing: birthright citizenship in this manner is actually almost uniquely a new world concept. So, most countries in North and South America have birthright citizenship, in which, generally speaking, if you're born within a nation's borders, you're a citizen. The exceptions are Colombia and the Dominican Republic, which generally require that the parents of the child to be citizens as well. Around 33 countries have birthright citizenship. I'll say, growing up in the United States, I was a little bit shocked when I realized that birthright citizenship, as I guess we've kind of understood it most recently, was not something that any of my family in like the Asian countries have. You have to be by blood. Your parents have to be by blood a citizen for you to be considered a citizen there. So it is very unique to the new world, even if this is all you know.
And we're going to talk a lot about the blood aspect as well, because there are another 30 or so countries that have some combination of jus soli and what is called jus sanguinis.
Sanguinis, you got
Sanguinis.
it.
Sanguinis. Killed
It's not
it.
not like I didn't listen to
Sanguinis.
some how to pronounce
Mm,
YouTube on that.
how sanguine of you. Anyways,
Exactly.
and many European countries have this version of birthright citizenship. But it typically applies because you have the jus sanguinis aspect. It applies kind of like in the Dominican Republic and Colombia to children who are born in a country and at least one of the parents is a citizen or a permanent resident. So Britain and France, for instance, follow this rule. If you're born in Britain and one of your parents is a citizen, you're a citizen. If you're born in Britain and one of your parents is a permanent resident, you're a citizen. So several of these countries also have something that's kind of along the lines of, you guys may remember the Dreamers, which were kids who were brought to the United States at a very young age and lived here their whole lives. What is their status? A lot of these countries have, if you've been there, it's almost like adverse possession of citizenship. If you've been there for a long enough period of time, you can also become a citizen. It's very just different things depending on the country. It's kind of all over the place. Um, so, there is this sort of blood aspect that goes even in a lot of countries that have birthright citizenship. It's sort of a kind of a quasi birthright citizenship.
Right. So the rest of the world and the majority of countries practice what Brett just described, use sanguinis. It doesn't matter if you're born in the country. If you aren't the children of citizens, you aren't a citizen. So countries like Russia, China, Japan, most of Eastern Europe, most of Africa, etc., they all follow this rule. This is what I mean when I say the majority of the world has something different than what we typically think of as birthright citizenship in the United States. So some countries include a right of return. Famously, Israel allows anyone of Jewish ancestry to return to Israel, even if they were not born there, have never been there before. But if they are of Jewish ancestry, they can go to Israel and they can become a citizen. In addition, pretty much every country allows some version of jus sanguinis. If your parents are American citizens, you are a citizen wherever you are born, for instance.
Right. So if your parents are traveling in another country, you're a citizen. In some cases, you'll have dual citizenship. I think Ted Cruz is like a dual citizen of Canada and the United States. I think he eventually renounced his Canadian citizenship because he was actually born in Canada, which all that that's
Wow.
another, yeah, that's like another thing, like when you can run for president thing, because we've had several presidents. Like some people think you have to be born in the United States, even if your parents are both citizens. If you're born somewhere else, you can't run for president. And we've had several presidents who were not born in the United States. John McCain was born on a military base, I think in Panama. I may be making that up. Ted Cruz was born in Canada. They both ran for president. So that's like a different version governed by a different principle, but interesting nonetheless. So that's sort of the state of play for citizenship around the world, how you become a citizen. So what does this executive order say? So after a preamble, here's what it says in operative part. So this is the important part. It is the policy of the United States that no department or agency of the United States government. Now I'll just stop here. Remember, this is an executive order. So how do executive orders work? The president is the executive and has underneath him all of these different agencies and departments that are part of the executive branch, and he can command them to do certain things. So executive orders, that's how they typically work. What he's doing is he's telling the various departments underneath him how to operate. So he's not really interpreting the law so much as just saying like, hey, don't do this, spend this money, don't spend this money.
We've talked about the administrative state before. He is the executive above the administrative state that issues, for example, all these citizen documents.
Right. So in this case, he's saying, hey, all the departments and agencies underneath me don't issue documents recognizing United States citizenship or accept documents issued by state, local, or other governments, because frankly, a lot of this happens in your local, in your states, in your cities. Birth certificates are issued. I mean, that kind of stuff forms the basis for citizenship in a lot of cases. So he's saying, hey, don't you do it and don't accept it either. You know, if there's a state that disagrees with this and they send up a birth certificate for someone who shouldn't be a citizen, don't accept it. Purporting to recognize United States citizenship to persons. So here is the group of people that the executive order purports to exclude from birthright citizenship. When that person's mother was unlawfully present in the United States and the person's father was not a United States citizen or lawful permanent resident at the time of said person's birth, or when the person's mother's presence in the United States was lawful but temporary and the person's father was not a United States citizen or lawful permanent resident at the time of said person's birth. So we'll talk about what that means in a second, but we'll move on to the next part. The next part says, subsection A, which is what I just read you, this section shall apply only to persons who are born within the United States after 30 days from the date of this order. And then subsection C, nothing in this order shall be construed to affect the entitlement of other individuals, including children of lawful permanent residents, to obtain documentation of the United States citizenship.
Okay, we always say it's incredibly important for you to go to the source, especially here, because you're going to see a lot of news sources purport to say that this executive order does things that it doesn't. So before we actually talk about what this executive order does, let's talk about what it does not do. It does not have any effect on current citizens. However you got that citizenship, whether you fall into those categories, today or would have fallen into those categories at the time you became a citizen, doesn't matter. If you're a citizen today, you're a citizen. Even if someone would not be a citizen under this order, anyone who had previously received citizenship is a citizen and remains a citizen. And we know this would be the case even if his executive order didn't explicitly say so, because it's consistent with what the Constitution's ban on ex post facto laws is. We can't change laws on you, backward seeking. There's an unfairness to that, and you can't foresee that sort of thing happening. So these types of laws do not apply ex post facto, and this one doesn't apply to anyone who's already a citizen today.
And one reason we're covering this is because we got so many requests to cover it, and a lot of the requests were people who wondered, how does this affect my kids? How does this affect X, Y, and Z? Which I thought was interesting because a lot of people just assumed, this is forward and backwards to the beginning of time. And as Alice notes, that is not how it works.
Yeah, and that's a really great point. We wanna make sure that people understand this because I'll say I think people obviously, if this affects you or someone you know, or you think it does, emotions can run high. So I know before people have even asked like the legal basis for this executive order, can it stand up in court? All these sorts of things. What does it do? One of their first things they'll say, usually to me, is like, well, you wouldn't be here. And I was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, let's see what the text of the order says. By the way, I would be here even if it were not ex post facto, but we'll talk about that later. So know that this does not apply to current citizens. And it is a very interesting legal question who it does apply to.
And so let's talk about that. What exactly does this do? It essentially says that if someone is born to a mother who is in the country illegally or only temporarily, so think student visa, and a student visa for someone who is intending to come here, go to class, and go back home. In my class at Harvard, we had the Princess of Bhutan was a student. She was always going back to Bhutan. She was going to go back to Bhutan and
She was
become the
going to
queen of
claim her
Bhutan.
throne.
Exactly. So if she had, for instance, had a child in the United States and then going back to Bhutan, as she always intended to do under this executive order, and I think probably under most interpretations of this, as we'll talk about later, that child would not be a citizen. So this makes that clear. So anyone whose mother is here illegally or only temporarily, and whose father is also not either a permanent resident or a legal citizen, that person, that child, will not receive the benefit of birthright citizenship. If the mother or the father is a permanent resident or a citizen, no change. Everything continues as it has always been.
And so you may be thinking, what situation is that other than, the Princess of Bhutan being here? I think there was a documentary made a couple years ago, or it's now been pretty well reported that there are these like birth tourism um, industries, mostly targeted at Asian countries, where they pay a very large sum. There's actually, a question as to whether these people even know the conditions they're going to be held in. And they come here for 3 months to await the birth of their child. No intention to stay. They're here on a temporary visa, visiting visa. But the purpose of them paying this third party tourism business is so that they can come here, have a technicality, have their child born in the United States so they can claim citizenship and always intend to go back. Their child may never even come to the United States. It's to, I guess, afford potential future benefits if that child ever wanted to be a US citizen. But that's an example of what this would exclude, those tourism birthing industries.
And as a matter of fact, just yesterday, there was a woman in California who was sentenced to, I believe, 4 years in prison for running one of these programs. Essentially, one of these birth tourism schemes to do exactly what Alice said. She specifically was focused on China, bring Chinese women over, they would have their child, then go back. And this is something that's also a national security concern, particularly with countries like China, because permanent residents of China, Chinese citizens, if they come to the United States, there are a lot of restrictions that can be placed on them, a lot of different sort of background checks and that sort of thing. Obviously, if you're a citizen, none of that applies. So someone who is in China and has United States citizenship, but has no loyalty to the United States at all. I mean, they literally were here for a week before they went back to China. That person is kind of the perfect agent of the Chinese government. And so it's a fascinating sort of thing going on there. That's one of the issues. The other thing you have are people who do want to be here. You've probably heard anchor babies, the term anchor babies. People who do want to be here, they come here, they have a child, the child is now a citizen, and that helps that person to stay in the United States. So two different circumstances, but two things that I think this executive order is intended to address. So essentially what it does is it converts what has been considered an unrestricted birthright citizenship to operate under something closer to what you see in Britain, what you see in France, the Dominican Republic, etc. You're going to have birthright citizenship, but it is connected in some way to the status of the parents. If the parents are permanent residents, birthright citizenship. If one of them is a citizen, birthright citizenship. If neither one of them are a citizen, if they're not here legally, then in that circumstance, you would not have birthright citizenship. You would not be a citizen. Of course, this is not really how it's been reported. That nuance has certainly been lost. Just some headlines related to it. PBS, Birthright Citizenship. What is it, and can Trump end it? Obviously, birthright citizenship is not going away no matter what, but this is sort of a theme. Washington Post, Trump signs executive order attempting to end birthright citizenship. Vox, can Trump end birthright citizenship? And one particularly funny one is from the BBC, which is the broadcasting arm of the British government, which is a country that has exactly the kind of restricted birthright citizenship we're talking about. The BBC, can Trump revoke birthright citizenship? Which would probably be a surprise to most of the people in Britain who have this version of birthright citizenship, that this is revoking it. So, it's always sort of the lowest common denominator when it comes to how these complex issues are discussed in the press. But putting aside how it has been reported on, is it constitutional? Is this something the president could even do?
Yeah, great question. And it all goes back to a case that you guys have probably heard of. We've talked about it before, and it's Dred Scott. So, Dred Scott, you may remember, was a pre Civil War case that was intended to answer the question of slavery once and for all. But of course, instead, it pushed the nation even closer to war. So, here's the question as presented by the Supreme Court in Dred Scott. The question is simply this: can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all of the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? The Supreme Court held that the answer to this question was no. Regardless of state law on the matter, the Supreme Court said a slave could never be a citizen. The court reached this conclusion even though at the time of the founding, Black men could vote in 5 of the 13 colonies, indicating that the founders would have absolutely believed that a slave, if freed, could be a citizen. And Dred Scott has lots and lots of issues with it.
We should do a whole episode on Dred Scott.
We should absolutely. But
Another
it's something
fascinating thing.
Fascinating, and a case that you will absolutely learn about when you go to law school. And as you can tell, even what we're discussing today has, history reaches back all the way into Dred Scott, but it's answering the question, or it's attempting to answer the question of what is citizenship.
Dred Scott's kind of like the Nazis. Like the Nazis are such a good example for everything that's wrong about various things that people tend to actually kind of overuse the Nazis. Dred Scott's the same way. Like if you read Dred Scott, everything that's wrong with, constitutional interpretation, legal argumentation, opinion writing, the politicization of the judiciary, everything is in Dred Scott. Like it's crazy. We really should do that case. And Dred Scott was immediately hated and very divisive. But overturning it actually became a core plank of the Republican platform. The Republican Party, which had formed very close to this as an anti-slavery party, which became sort of a northern party, whereas the Democratic Party became much more of a southern party, setting up the Civil War. And it would take the Civil War to do it and overturn this opinion, though technically it's never been overturned. But in 1866, right after the Civil War ended, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. It reads that all persons born in the United States and not subject to any foreign power, including Indians not taxed, are hereby declared to be citizens of the United States. This applied to every race and color without regard to any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude. So that's how the Civil Rights Act of 1866 read, which was meant to basically overturn Dred Scott and make it clear that in the United States, we were going to have some version of birthright citizenship that would apply to a lot of different people.
Right. So even though, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was in response to Dred Scott, but Congress also recognized the problem because Dred Scott, as we said, was not overturned. It was still the law of the land. And under it, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that they had just passed was probably unconstitutional. So enter the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. This is like a schoolhouse rock. How how democracy works here. We're using all the different parts because you can amend a constitution. So the 14th Amendment begins, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside.
So immediately something should jump out to you. So the birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment is not unrestricted. In order for a person born in the United States to be a citizen, they must be, quote, subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And that's the rub. That is the thing that people argue about what exactly that means and how exactly it is a limitation on this form of citizenship.
So, as always, what does it not mean? It doesn't mean jurisdiction in the way that we commonly think about it, especially on this podcast. When we talk about like when a crime is committed, we talk about what jurisdiction are they in, state, local, federal, because everyone in the United States, regardless of their nationality or citizenship, if they commit a crime, they're subject to the jurisdiction for the purpose of prosecution. So it doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not. If you murder someone in any state in the United States, a legal alien, doesn't matter. You are still subject to jurisdiction for purposes of prosecution. But if this clause of the 14th Amendment were that simple, then it would also be superfluous. It would essentially mean the provision reads, anyone born in the United States who is in the United States. That's duplicative. You don't need both parts of that sentence. So basic rules of construction tell you that the provision can't be superfluous in that way. And that limitation cannot mean the jurisdiction when we talk about like where a crime is committed.
And I think it's important because it is easy or even if you're a lawyer, if you read the provision and you just think about what is jurisdiction, well, the jurisdiction of the federal government, that's vast, and really anybody in the United States, it's very easy to think of it as meaning that. But no one who's actually looked at this provision thinks that what it means, because it can't mean that. You would not need that. You would just have something that essentially said, hey, if you're born in the United States, you're a citizen. Now, what's interesting about it is it's obviously intended to do what the Civil Rights Act of 1866 did, because that was the whole reason they passed it. They wanted to make sure that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was something that you could not attack. You could not say, well, Dred Scott's still good law, even if you don't like it. Yeah, there was Civil War, but who cares? You didn't pass a constitutional amendment. So this is still unconstitutional. But what's interesting is even though they had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, they didn't just use the language of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Instead, they use this language. And as we're going to talk about later in the next episode, because we're going to do two parts on this, the Supreme Court is going to spend a lot of time on this language and what exactly it means and what exactly it encompasses and who it is attempting to identify. But as we're thinking about this Civil Rights Act of 1866, it does provide some insight. As we said, the whole point of the 14th Amendment, or at least this portion of the 14th Amendment, is to overturn Dred Scott and make the CRA unimpeachable. And the CRA specifically excluded a couple groups of people: Indians not taxed and people, quote, not subject to any foreign power. And in fact, Native Americans were not granted citizenship by the 14th Amendment, despite the subject to the jurisdiction language. And there were actually Supreme Court cases on this. If someone is a native and they're subject to the jurisdiction, they leave a reservation, they move into the city, they're doing all sorts of stuff, would they be a citizen? And the Supreme Court said no, because of this language. And in fact, this is shocking to a lot of people, I think. Natives weren't granted citizenship until 1924, about 100 years ago, by the Indian Citizenship Act, which is also a fascinating piece of legislation. Really interesting politics. Very interesting how the various tribes reacted to it. Some of the tribes were very much in favor of it. The Oneida Indians were very much in favor of it. The tribe from Oklahoma that we've talked about before, that I can't remember, the killers of the flower moon.
Yeah.
The Osage, very much in favor of it. But a lot of the tribes weren't. They didn't like this idea. They didn't want to be citizens, and they certainly didn't want to be forced to be citizens. So it's fascinating, right? But anyways, nevertheless, it gives you some color to this amendment and its limitations. And there were other groups, specifically the children of diplomats, for instance, which were never considered citizens for obvious reasons. They're here on behalf of a foreign power. Yes, they're living in the United States. Some of them have diplomatic immunity in the like Lethal Weapon 2 idea, but a lot of them didn't. I mean, some even people who were just part of the diplomatic corps who very much could be prosecuted were under their jurisdiction, were not citizens because they were considered to be sort of under the authority of a foreign power, subject to a foreign power. Yes, they're in the United States, but they're not in the United States in the way that the 14th Amendment is supposed to encompass. So, given all this and this sort of backstory, if this debate were taking place in, say, the late 1800s, I think the administration would probably have a solid argument about what they're trying to do here and how they're trying to carve this out. But there's a big strike against them. Because typically when you're interpreting an executive order or interpreting really any law or any constitutional provision, one of the things you look to is how has it been interpreted? Like, is this a big change? For how long has this been considered to be the way that this constitutional provision should be read? This idea of precedent and tradition carry a lot of weight when you're trying to interpret constitutional provisions.
So we've had a legal briefs episode. I think we've talked about stare decisis before because we have a common law system here in the United States. And that means how a provision has been interpreted over a long period of time carries a lot of weight with the Supreme Court. So even if people on the Supreme Court think something is wrongly decided, if that's the way it's been interpreted for 100, 200 years, that itself has weight because of the way our system works. And the idea that someone born in the United States, unless they are in a very special circumstance, like the child of an ambassador of a Native American before 1924, or is a citizen, has been the law of the land for a very long time. If only we had a Supreme Court case that can give us some clarity then. Well, guess what, guys? It turns out we do. United States versus Wong Kim Ark. This is an 1898 case, and it addresses the very question of what birthright citizenship entails and may be the very key to whether President Trump's executive order about birthright citizenship is constitutional. And that ends our episode today.
Yeah, we're going to spend a lot of time on Wong Kim Ark. It is a fascinating case. If you guys want some homework, you can read it before we talk about it next week. It is really long, and it is like a history lesson. I mean, we're going to talk about this. We're going to be talking about stuff that was happening in the 1300s and various different ways that English law and French law and these different conceptions of citizenship, how they developed, what they meant, what it means to be a subject. I mean, just some fascinating stuff. And the Supreme Court really digs into this to try and figure out what this constitutional provision means. And I think that's fascinating for a couple reasons. But one reason it's fascinating, and one reason that I think is worth remembering, is these questions are nowhere near as simple as people try and make them out to be. It's always politically advantageous to act like something is either obviously true or obviously false. And if you followed any of the debate on this the last couple of weeks, that's essentially what you've seen. If you see people who support this executive order, they will act like this is so clearly the case, it's just absurd that anybody would disagree. And then people who think this is an unconstitutional executive order will say the opposite. This executive order has already been enjoined by a federal judge who said it was like the most unconstitutional thing they ever saw. Now, of course, they picked that judge for a reason because lawyers are smart. We are not dumb. There's a reason the lawsuit wasn't filed in Texas, for instance, because if it had been filed in Texas, it is likely that a judge in Texas would have had a much different view. Manipulating the courts is very easy because you can identify what judge is going to get your case depending on where you file it. So if you see an executive order or a law passed by a Democrat, it's going to be challenged in various places in Texas or a few other places where there's one judge. One judge courts are particularly popular because if you file it there, that judge is going to get it. So you may recall in the first Trump administration, there were a lot of Hawaii cases, there were a lot of Washington cases. And so that is another legal briefs, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that you can essentially judge shop, find a judge, and they will issue a nationwide injunction, and then it freezes in place whatever's happening. Abused by both sides, but something we can talk about some more. This issue, though, is probably going to continue to wind its way through the courts because what we're discussing has some novel elements. It would not surprise me to see this in front of the Supreme Court. At the end of next episode, we're going to tell you what the law actually is, because I think we're really good at predicting things. We're going to know exactly what the law actually is, or what it's going to be, and how the Supreme Court's going to end up voting. We're going to do that. So that's get your votes together, Alice.
It's not like we said in literally the last recording that we did. It's not that we're good at predicting. It's that this is the way you want your law to be. We do is we've read a lot of the law. We know how the law is shaping up and what the rationale is, because what you don't want is a whack-a-mole system of legal jurisprudence. So when we say we are good at predicting, anyone who's like learned in this area should see where the tea leaves are falling. It should not be a total surprise. Although, of course, every season of the Supreme Court has their surprises. So I'm not saying there aren't surprises every season, but on this season of SCOTUS,
this season
of SCOTUS,
the Supreme Court,
who will get the rose?
Yeah, exactly. You're always going to wonder.
But this is a very interesting question. I think it's really worth spending 2 episodes on because of how much history goes into this. I mean, this goes to the core of what it means to be an American, which I know we have a lot of international listeners, but for Americans and Texans, that's a very important question, and something that I had never really thought that much about until this most recent debate on the campaign trail, and now with this executive order.
Yeah, I mean, it is fascinating. And I think another thing, or another reason I think it's important to discuss it, is just because I think it's important to talk about these things and sort of talk about them in rational ways, talk about sort of what the facts are on both sides, and then you can reach your own conclusion. I think we're all way too reactionary. I think that is something that the last, I don't know, 20 years, 30 years, maybe the entirety of the history of the United States has proven that we're just very reactionary, and much better to actually think about these things and discuss them, I think, before you come to a conclusion. And so that's what we're going to do. Well, with that, Alice, do you want to do a question?
Absolutely.
This is a more sort of what we expected the length of legal briefs to be. It's a little long.
I know.
There was a reason we call it legal briefs. It was supposed
to be brief.
It was going to be like 20 minutes. We were going to do like 20-minute shows. Yeah.
I just think you lied to me when I was like, can we handle another podcast? You're like, it'll be 20 minutes.
It's going to be 20 minutes. We can do 20 minutes
so in our easy. Sleep. You could do it in your sleep.
Yeah. That's pretty much what I said. Okay. Okay, let's see. This is from Best Review Comment Ever.
Wow.
And setting yourself up for the high bar. I have noticed a trope in movies and TV, which, as we said in the last episode, that probably means it's not true, where a cop will demean their informant/snitch for being just that. I find it ironic that cops have the same position for a snitch that someone in the criminal world would have, and counterintuitive, because how does degrading the informant for being a snitch motivate them to continue snitching? My question is, do you find this trope to have any truth in your experience and interactions with law enforcement? No. I mean, that, it's not to say that law enforcement has the highest regard for people who are involved in criminality and come over to Team America, right? But I mean, typically just most of that stuff is just not true. Like the way the police treat criminals, defendants, is very different. And typically what you actually see is a lot of respect. It's much better to be very respectful of someone, a defendant, than it is to treat them with disrespect, because you're much more likely to earn their trust, to get them to talk, to make them feel comfortable. I mean, I don't want to sound like it's all manipulative, but to a certain extent it is. And also there's a professionalism about the police. And so usually with their informants, informants can be a bit of, some jokers, but they're typically very respectful of them, and certainly not to their face. They don't degrade them. And a lot of informants are professional informants. You can make a
A
lot of
lot of
money
money.
being the right kind of informant. You really can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think maybe so it's not the trope, but we've talked about this before, like jailhouse informants who claim to have information, but it's not really information or it's not useful information, or they just make it up because they're bored or they're trying to have some sort of chips to be able to, exchange to better their position, whatever it may be. So, law enforcement, we have to make sure that we are sussing out the right informants, but it doesn't mean like you treat anyone with, less than courtesy. But it's possible that you may have that jailhouse informant. So there's no way that they know who killed John Benet Ramsey. They weren't even alive then. Like if he's over there being like, come on, you know, come help me get on parole. I'll tell you who killed John Benet Ramsey. Okay, buddy. Like I'm sure you do. They have to be discerning about which snitches, they're not called snitches, by the way, they're called informants, which informants have useful information and which ones they'll utilize, because actually there are a lot more people who want to be informants than the law enforcement actually need. We don't really need super low level people. It's much more useful to have someone who has access to the kingpin, right? Someone who is in the know, who knows the lingo, who knows when shipments are coming and going, and who can get the information that is actually useful for these takedowns. So, in actuality, just because you sign up to be Team America and you may like live a little bit in the gray area of, what is legal, doesn't always mean you'll be taken up on it. So, there's that as well.
So one more. Kimmy Sema is a lawyer who hates being a lawyer and wants to know our thoughts on transitioning to another career.
Love it. I'm just kidding. Sorry. Being a lawyer is wonderful,
I
but
hope
I
you're
will
a
say
government lawyer, because if you are,
you
get
can
8 months.
resign today, literally resign today.
9 months. Yeah, 9 months.
So I do think it is a little difficult. Hopefully it changes with time now that the barriers, like law school is so expensive and it takes up, at least 3 years of your time. If you're going to night school, it may take up even longer, that people are not just looking at it as a default degree. Cause I think for a very long time, when people would say like, I don't know what to do, I'll go to law school. That's a very common trope, right? Because it's not a specialty in like, you have to know sciences or you're not going to be operating on people. It's really a school of thought, right? You're going to law school to learn how to think, which you can then apply to many different aspects. But we always tell people only go to law school if you want to be a lawyer, because if you want to be a politician or you want to be a great writer, there are other avenues to get there that will better prepare you than, a six-figure dollar debt, 3 years of your life, and being next to probably not very interesting people for a very long time. So with that, I do think there are
It was pretty
many
depressing
more.
for this person who's already a lawyer.
I know, right? With that said, I think there are a lot of people who enter the law even wanting to be lawyers and then realize it's not like TV. It's actually so much grind. It is a very unforgiving profession. It is not, I always say, it's like the worst mistress ever. It is not conducive to like a life, a lot of legal jobs. So I understand a lot of people who burn out. And I think people should totally transition out if they're transitioning to something they're passionate about. So I think just leaving the law, which is a stable career, could be a stable career. It may be foolhardy if you don't know what's next.
And I think that it's a good point. You may just hate the law you're doing. And there are a lot of different legal jobs that you could think about, and people can reinvent themselves in the middle of a career, even if you spent the first 10 years doing corporate law. If you want to be a litigator, you can always hang out a shingle. You can always learn how to do a specific thing. You have all the skills to do anything in the law. So there's always that option. But it is certainly the case that you do find lawyers all over the place. I mean, you'll find lawyers in every single job in America. And the number of times we'll run into people who will say, oh, yeah, actually, I went to law school. Now I write movies in Hollywood or whatever. I mean, there are a lot of different options. So I would say, think about, number one, is it really the law you hate, or do you just hate your job? And frankly, it may not even be the area of the law you're in. You just may be in a place that's bad. I hated being a lawyer the first year I was a lawyer. because I hated the law firm I was at. And in my mind, I've always thought I never want to go back to a firm, but that's probably wrong. It was just that firm was not right for me. There are probably firms where it would be fantastic, so I would say keep an open mind and just remember you have this massive skill, you have this massive ability, and you've proven yourself in a lot of ways. So don't feel held back. I mean, think of this as an opportunity to do something. Maybe you should start a podcast. Look, there's plenty of really bad lawyers who have podcasts and very successful YouTube channels. So you could do that. And we would support you. Let us know when you start your show.
Well, that was great. Thanks for these questions. If you don't know yet, you can ask a question. We will answer it. It could be about the law, it could be not about the law, it could be personal advice, whatever you want, if you leave a 5-star review. And we love hearing your thoughts about this episode and anything else you want to hear about from here on out. This is what this podcast is for, to answer and delve into legal questions that you have about what you see in the news. You can give those ideas to us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com. You can also find us on Instagram, TikTok, maybe X, Twitter, and Facebook. We love hearing from you guys.
That's
Brett,
another legal briefs.
TikTok. I know.
Yeah, it's TikTok. Can you actually do that? You have a congressional statute signed by the president, a law. Can you just say, you know what? Nah. No, I'm not sure you can do that either. So,
Yeah, that's look, this is like, we are in a time of wealth for Legal Briefs episodes because I want to know the answers to
start
these questions
podcast 3
as well. No. Let's just keep these 2. We're not trying to grow. But we love discussing these. They are fascinating for me. I hope they're fascinating for you guys as well. Brett, is there anything else you'd like to talk about before? Don't give away too much about next week's, Birthright Citizenship.
I don't think so. No, I got nothing.
Wow, it does a first. Wow. Thank you guys for joining us. Check us out also at the Prosecutors Podcast. We love your support, and leave a 5-star review. We'll answer your question. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutors Legal Briefs.
Yeah.
Woo.
Rock on.
That was fun.